All right, so this is what you should have downloaded right here. It looks different if you have Able or Bose. I'm also going to encourage them to post this link to this article in National Geographic about the Netherlands and their amazing agriculture, if you have time to read it. But we're going to go to this, and I'd like you to follow along. All right, so we're talking about different sectors of the economy, and we're only focusing on agriculture today. Agriculture falls within this primary sector of the economy. The other things that are primary sector, fishing, timber, mining, anything that you're directly extracting something from the earth. All right? The chapter that we're going to be starting this week is secondary. That is the processing of raw materials into something else, manufacturing. All right? And we'll also be talking about tertiary, which is services. And most Americans actually work in services. Very few Americans work in the primary industry as farmers because our farmers are so good, they make so much that we don't need that many farmers. All right, so in part A here, it's asking you to know about the development and diffusion of agriculture. And so the guy that you need to know who studied these different agricultural herds, his name is Carl Sauer. And from the Cahoots, you should already know that agriculture began in Southeast Asia, okay, with vegetative planting. So again, that is the division of an already existing crop. Right? You just separate it and you plant it somewhere else. That knowledge first happened in Southeast Asia. You can kind of see an example, right, of taking this, or recognizing, oh, if I put this in the ground somewhere else, it's going to grow. That is not considered the beginning of the agricultural revolution. That begins in the Fertile Crescent. That knowledge that crops come from seeds, that's the Neolithic or the first agricultural revolution. 10 to 12,000 years ago, you should commit that date to memory. And most of you knew that happened in the Fertile Crescent. All right, so you can see the other areas that we already kind of talked about. Spots, right, where they figured out how to farm on their own. So it wasn't just diffusion. For instance, they figured out how to farm in the Fertile Crescent, and the knowledge of that did spread through diffusion to the Nile River Valley, right? But it didn't spread all the way across the ocean to the Americas. They figured it out on their own there, as well as in India, as well as in China and different parts of Africa. Okay? So that's all here in section 1. The other thing in section 1, as an example, they want you to be familiar here with patterns of diffusion. And so I'm giving this example of the Columbian Exchange. And this is actually pretty important because once trade begins, especially internationally, it really changes agriculture and the economy of other countries. So if the potato is native to South America, but where do you think of the potato? Ireland, right? Because it totally changed the economy of Ireland. People became dependent on the potato. That's essentially what this is saying. How have different crops spread around the world? How have they really changed the cultural landscape, right, and what we grow and the economies of these places? Bananas is another thing. Not native to Central America, but a huge export that comes from that area. Horses, right, brought to the New World, but they are native to Asia. All right, so this is just one example of what they mean by diffusion and how crops that originate elsewhere can impact new places. All right, let's go on to the second thing. Explain the connection between physical geography and agricultural practices. Okay, so this is obvious to us, right? Like the climate of a place, how good the soil is, the landforms that are there. Right? You can't do different types of agriculture high up in the mountains. Right? So this is, I think, common sense that physical geography really matters for agriculture. We can impact that by building terraces, for instance, right? In a mountainous area, you can dig into the land to create flat surfaces. And this is especially common in parts of Asia where they do wet rice farming. We can irrigate a place that maybe shouldn't be irrigated, right? Because it's wasteful with the water, but it works, and then you can make something agriculturally productive that wasn't. We can burn down the rainforest like they're doing right now in Brazil and turn it into cattle ranching land. So definitely people can alter the landscape, but it's easier if you don't have to. All right, and so certain physical geography is better for different types of agriculture. So briefly take a second here, talk to the person next to you, look at that example question on terracing. This shows you why you have to know some physical geography. All right, 4 of these places have something in common. They have what? Mountains. Which one doesn't? Niger or Niger, right? Okay? This is what a terrace looks like, terrace farming. All right? And that's why we had you guys do maps throughout the year. I don't expect you to remember everything, right? But Nepal is a great example of, it's the rooftop of the world, right? With the Himalayas and some of the other major ranges. Maybe, I think all of your teachers showed you wake skating, where they took the wake skate to the Philippines and were wake skating the rice paddies there. Hopefully that stuck with you. And that's the type of question where they'll ask you to apply your knowledge of farming and also physical geography. Okay, let's go on to number 3, the second agricultural revolution. So we figured out where farming started. That's the first agricultural revolution. Now we're on to the second agricultural revolution. And that's really linked to the industrial revolution and becoming a better farmer, using machinery to become more productive. And some of the other things that they did, for instance, here's a steam-powered plow that's back in 1912. Doesn't look very fancy compared to what we have today. But the ability to use machines, think about how much more productive you can be if before you were pulling your plow with an animal or doing it by hand. There's other things as well, like the Enclosure Acts, that allow the second agricultural revolution to happen. So with the Enclosure Acts, you're kicking common people off of agricultural land, and you're fencing it in for one usually wealthy, noble landowner to have. All right, and so the people that were kicked off, in general, chose not to keep farming because the land that they were offered wasn't good farmland. And so, in essence, it made them have little choice but to go to the cities that were beginning, right, with this factory work of the Industrial Revolution. And this is just in England, but it's one example of how a government policy, right, changes labor, right, changes your options for work, and made the Industrial Revolution possible. Okay, so the small landowners could not afford a lot of these costs of enclosure, and so they were forced out to the cities. Some of the other new technology here, the railroad comes as a part of the Industrial Revolution, and that opens up the American West. Barbed wire, something you may not think of. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because if in wide open spaces, you're a rancher and your neighbor's a farmer, if your cows walked into their field and ate the crops, that was a big problem. But out in the prairies in America, there's no wood to build fences. And it was, very difficult to do so. So when something like barbed wire was created, this totally changed people's willingness to farm. Because now they could protect their land. They made it easier to farm the prairies. And that one invention that was cheap to buy, right, was a big game changer. We already talked about some of these harvesting machines. So some of these things that are part of the second agricultural revolution, you definitely need to know. All right. The Green Revolution is number 4 on your sheet. Analyze the consequences of the Green Revolution on food supply and the environment. So you should pick up right away that this is an amazing thing for food supply. We become so much more productive, but the negatives are that it's bad for the environment. All right, now I like this slide because it starts off with something that confuses people. Why is it called the Green Revolution if it's not good for the environment? Well, this idea of going green is a relatively recent phenomenon that means, environmentally friendly. The Green Revolution began, decades ago, before that was even a thing. Why it's called the Green Revolution is that it allowed for farming in places that weren't arable before. So it's kind of like the greening of the earth. And it was a huge increase in food production. So they used different types of seeds. So that's something that you would have to talk about, right? High yield rice especially, but also wheat and corn were the focus. Better seeds and irrigation. And then of course, the fertilizers and the pesticides that are a part of this is why it's bad for the environment. All right, it's a part of this third agricultural revolution when we start applying science now to the food production process. And this guy, Norman Borlaug, is the guy to know. They probably won't ask you to know his name per se, because he didn't make a model. We will have to know some of those models, like the von Thunen model. But he won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending food shortages, for saving millions and millions of people from famine. And he spent most of his life in lesser developed countries, originally Mexico, and then countries throughout Asia, especially India, helping them implement the Green Revolution technology. Okay, so I listed some of the positives and negatives there for you, but let's go on to that next practice question at the top of page 2. Take a second.
Have there only been 2 agricultures?
So this is part of the third. So the first one is figuring out how to farm, the second one is machinery and industrial revolution based, the third one is like biotech.
Maybe it's just one that's global. I don't think it's really one to make it. No, I'm doing it in a second.
All right, what's the answer? E as an elephant is right. All right, so it's about this technology, right? The third agricultural revolution is about that biotechnology. And of course, the widespread use of it, not just in more developed countries, but with the Green Revolution especially in lesser developed countries. Dramatic increases in global grain production. So, if you guys remember back to chapter 2, Thomas Malthus, who said, we're screwed because world's population is growing faster than food supply. Do you remember that guy? You need to know him. He was wrong because of this. He did not foresee the Green Revolution. He did not guess that we would become so much more agriculturally productive. All right, food production has increased at a faster rate than anybody really foresaw. Okay, does require more energy, but it raises yields, right? The amount of food that you can grow. Okay, the last thing about the third agricultural revolution, I just wanted to show you this crazy advanced machinery combine. I don't even know what it is. Right? The amazing machines that we have presently in the United States, that's why less than 2% of our population can farm. Because they have stuff like this that are guided by GPS and all automated, right? Can be flown by, you can use drones to like guide them and have an aerial picture of where your combines are. It's really amazing. So that is all part of why the United States and other developed countries are so good at farming, so efficient today. Okay, so that's it for part A. We're going to do part B and maybe part of C. We'll see how far before I give you a break. All right, this next section, major agricultural regions. So we need to know what is grown where. All right, so this links to what we talked about briefly with climate mattering, but now they're going to want you to be more specific. So this is a map that I like, the Köppen classification map for climate. It's not about agriculture yet, right? And I think it's pretty straightforward. Humid, low latitude. That would be where it's tropical. It's really humid, Low latitude means what? Near the equator. Low latitude, right? Near the equator. What degree is the equator? 0. Make sense? Low latitude. All right, so you can see, right, the tropical areas are going to be near the equator, and they're going to do different types of agriculture than places that are too dry, right? Or like us. We are in the mid-latitudes here. There's warm mid-latitude and cold mid-latitude, which would be here, right? And we grow different things in the Midwest than they would grow in the South. All right. Mountains, of course, the highlands areas, that's definitely a different climate region as well. All right, so climate impacts agriculture, and this then is the agricultural map that we spent some time looking at, and we had you guys fill in the chart that I've listed here. So what I want you to do is try to come up with 3 forms of subsistence agriculture, 3 forms of commercial agriculture, and see if using this map and your neighbor, we'll just take maybe 3 or 4 minutes, you can fill in this chart here. You can use what's written above it, but think about the different types of agriculture, what climate they do well in, and where that happens. And I'll leave this chart up as well.
Is that where you I start off with 3 kills. Sense of no, just dry. It's just dry. It's just dry. Rice. Humid tropical area. So it's like mountains. You location for Southeast Asia. No, and substation. No, shifting cultivation. Why'd you do all that? I already know where it's from. When you get there, Amazon. And East Asia. Don't forget East Asia. We already got that done. Plantation.
One more minute. You don't have to get it all. I just really want you to be thinking about this and not just zoning out the screen to me the whole time.
Fixed livestock. There we go.
Crop and livestock. All right, so it's all right if you're not finished. Hopefully you're able to write down a couple examples of subsistence, a couple examples of commercial, and this is really important, right? How, that is the first division, subsistence or commercial, right? And then where can they do it? So just looking at the map before I go into my individual slides, what is this green? You know, this light green color? Shifting cultivation, which yes, slash and burn is one of the ways they do that, right? They slash the undergrowth and it burns, right? And the fertility that improves in the soil before it's rained away and they have to move on, they have to shift. Okay, so this is happening in tropical areas. Like, make it make sense to you. Don't just memorize, but think about, okay, so if I know this area is tropical, right? See this orange area is tropical? Well, what type of agriculture do they do in tropical areas? Shifting cultivation. And you can see that, right, in tropical areas throughout the world. So there's a link there. In areas that are too dry, you know this area, right, is what desert? The Sahara Desert. Look at all these places where it's dry. You know that they're not going to be able to grow crops there. But given what they know about the physical geography, they can take their animals around, right, to different spots at different times of year to make sure that they have enough to graze on. So what type of agriculture is that? Pastoral nomadism, right? You know that in certain parts of Asia, right, it's intensive subsistence, but here where it's warmer, look at how it matches up, right? You can see that climate matters. So in southern China, what type of intensive subsistence? Wet rice, whereas this would be intensive other. Right, so it should make sense without feeling like you have to memorize this whole map. Think about how climate impacts what you can grow, and then of course, we know that lesser developed countries, they're going to be the intensive subsistence versus a commercial, more developed country like us. We have different farming options because we have giant farms, right? We don't need to have individual families trying to scratch out a living farming. All right, so here are some that I came up with. Don't race to fill yours in, all right? And what you have might be right as well. I just came up with the ones that I thought were the easiest. Pastoral nomadism happens in dry places. So I gave an example, intensive wet rice. You know, the climate would probably, I have wet here. Of course, you could have, if we go back, I would pick warm mid-latitude if you were using the chart. But the point is that it's not too cold, right? They can't grow rice in places that it is. Shifting cultivation is tropical. I always think of the Amazon, and so I put Brazil. There's many places that they do it. Ranching. Now, ranching is the commercial version of pastoral nomadism, right? So you can think that as well. And in Brazil, in the western United States, a lot of ranching. When you think of Texas, maybe you put Texas. That would be great for ranching. This one's the easiest. It's my favorite. Mediterranean, Mediterranean, Mediterranean. Right? Okay, and then plantations. Sometimes my students mess up plantations because it's happening usually in lesser developed countries, so you want to put it under subsistence. But remember, plantations are growing cash crops. It is commercial agriculture. So it should be in that bottom category there. Maybe in Central America. All right. So just a couple pictures to stick with you here related to this. Remember that rice fields need to be flooded, right? And so climate and water availability really matter for wet rice. Mediterranean, they're known for vineyards. And we've already covered this, but it's often a question. Maybe they'll show you a map, right? And these areas around the Mediterranean, South Africa, parts of Australia, are shaded in. Right? That is Mediterranean agriculture. Wine, especially, fruit, orchard crops are also present there. Take a look at ranching, both ranching and pastoral nomadism. And then plantations and shifting cultivation happen in tropical areas. Things like sugar cane coming out of the Caribbean, The rubber trees that we talked about, yes, they can make synthetic rubber, but initially it was happening in Brazil, right? And that they smuggled the rubber seedlings out of Brazil, and the British used them elsewhere in their colonial empire because rubber is so important, especially for industrialization. Cotton and coffee and bananas, and all of these things are grown on plantations. Bananas began in Southeast Asia when we were talking about diffusion, right, but make a huge impact on the economy of Latin America. When a place grows one thing only, it's called monoculture. And you should know that that's bad because if the price of that on the world markets falls, those people have nothing else. Right? So especially, we saw that video on the coffee farmers, and they felt like they were at the mercy, right, of those coffee markets. It makes it very difficult to educate your kids and have a good standard of living if those prices fall too low. I thought this was just interesting to see places where they grow bananas. The largest exports, notice all of these, most of these places, I guess, are in Latin America, but they actually grow a lot in India as well. They're just not exported because India has such a huge population that they're going to consume most of what is grown locally. All right, so let's move on then to the practice question at the bottom of this page. You might not know this one, and then there's one more on the next page. So work on these two questions and see what you come up with, and I'll go over them in a couple minutes.
It's crazy. Because other ones have like
No, that's in the Mediterranean doesn't take place in I wouldn't say that because that's not
the Mediterranean.
They don't do it because they're religion.
Yes, the grapes are going for wine production. That means they don't do it, so why is it different? Let's read the other one. It's happy.
Move on to the next one if you have it here. The two practice questions here.
No, it's kind of like share. It's basically just like
Are you ready?
No, multi-cropping is in the sense of what rice because they can plant two things. It's like it's
All right, so here they are. Agriculture in California differs from other Mediterranean regions because farms there use more irrigation. You may not have known that, so let's go through some of these. Grapes are grown for wine production. Well, that doesn't make them different. That makes them similar, right? That's common in most places where they do Mediterranean agriculture. That's the main focus is vineyards, all right? Farms are smaller. Are farms going to be smaller in America? No, so you rule out C. Farms rely on local labor. That doesn't necessarily make us different than elsewhere. And California also gets a lot of immigrant labor, especially for agricultural purposes, coming from nearby Central America. So that's not the right answer. And then this is a false statement. Wheat is not grown as a cover crop anywhere really in Mediterranean regions. So it's false, and it can't be similar or different in California than the other places. So even if you didn't know that farms use more irrigation, maybe through a process of elimination you could. And that is something that you should know about America because we do have advanced technology and we unfortunately take water for granted here, even though we shouldn't. We do irrigate places, especially in California, that maybe we really shouldn't. Right? They're really dependent on that groundwater. And we may not be able to be for much longer in the future. All right, and then the next one, which of the following is a characteristic of shifting cultivation? Remember, shifting cultivation is a subsistence form of agriculture, so they don't have a lot of technology. So it's not going to be a dependency on irrigation, right? They don't have fancy irrigation systems. Sharecropping, nope. Remember that happened in the U.S. South after the Civil War. That's not prevalent in tropical areas with indigenous people. Production of cash crops for export? Wouldn't that make it commercial agriculture? So that's not the answer. Demand for wage laborers, again, that's commercial agriculture. This is not. This is a subsistence group of people, small groups of people, right, who move on from field to field once that soil is no longer productive. So you're left with multi-cropping, and they do that. They're not monoculture because they're trying to produce enough food for their community. And you want to eat a variety of things, right? So they're planting many different types of crops, right? And they're trying to be as productive with that land as they can before they have to move on. So these are the types of questions that they do. So even if you think you understand the types of agriculture, you're essentially applying them. So it is maybe a little bit harder. All right. So let's move on to number 2 here. Analyze the economic forces that influence agricultural practices. So we've already talked about the difference between subsistence and commercial. Those are the 2 most important categories. Is the food consumed on the farm? That would be subsistence for your family. Or for export for sale, right? That would be commercial. So subsistence versus commercial practices. And then one thing that my students sometimes get confused on is intensive agriculture versus extensive agriculture. This has to do with how much work you as a farmer are putting into the land. So if you are working it very intensely, like intensive subsistence, you probably have a small plot of land. Think about like a rice farm that requires a lot of human labor. Right? That is intensive. This guy here, this is an intensive example. And pretty primitive, right? Still using horses for agriculture instead of machinery. Right? Subsistence agriculture is the most common form of agriculture in the world. We forget this because commercial farms make so much more. But we're talking about farmer, right? Most of the world's farmers are small subsistence farmers in Asia. Right? Don't forget that. In India, in China, more than half of their people are still subsistence farmers. So even though in your minds you're thinking about manufacturing coming out of China, which is true, right? Or call centers in India maybe, which is true, the majority of people still are living, a subsistence farming lifestyle. That's changing, but it hasn't gone half yet. People are leaving rural areas and moving to cities. But still more than half of them live in those rural areas, and that's why this is true. They actually didn't shade India and China here because some farmers do sell some produce at market. So it's kind of that transition phase. And here's an example of extensive agriculture. So you don't have to work it that hard. You've got a ranch. You've got a lot of land, and your animals, they go out and graze. It sounds, pretty nice to me. Little labor ranching is an example of extensive agriculture. You're not working that land by hand, right? But it requires a lot more land. So when we get to Von Thunen, it'll make sense, the different rings, because you need a lot of land for the animals to graze on. But you couldn't afford that much land close to the city because land is too expensive. Okay. So let's go on then to number 3. Now this is about agribusiness. Explain the spatial organization of large-scale commercial agriculture and agribusiness. So my picture here is showing how the big agribusiness farmer, right, is replacing small family farms. And that is happening in America. We're seeing a decline in the number of farmers, right? So less farmers, but the farm size is getting bigger. So that means the farmers that are left have large-scale operations. Therefore, they must be very efficient. They have to use a lot of machinery because there's so few of them. All right, so a little bit more on vertical integration. Now, this comes about midway down, number 3 right here. So it says the family farm is no longer the center necessarily because large corporations in some industries like chicken, poultry farming, own all parts of the production process. So when we were looking at the Kahoot, at vertical integration, some of you weren't sure what that meant. Here's a visual of it. The one company controls every step of this process, from the breeding of the chicks, right, to the hatching of the eggs. So they own the hatchery, and then the little chicks are sent to the grow houses, which is what we saw in our video, Food Inc., right? They drop off the chicks, and they contract with those growers for, what was it, 90 days, right? And all of a sudden, they feed them whatever the company gives them, right? The feed is provided by the company, and 3 months later, they go and they pick up those now grown chicks, sometimes called broilers. They're sent to the company's processing plant for processing, right? And then the company distributes them, markets them, does all those commercials that you would watch. This is modern day farming, where that one corporation controls all of that, right? That's what we mean by vertical integration. So the last little bullet point there, actually I think I have one more slide here. If you need more information on vertical integration, it's a lot of words here. It just takes you through what I just explained. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's present in the PowerPoint if you need more info, because sometimes this, you're like, I don't know what that means. So this is the words that support it. All right, so before I let you do the practice question, it says the transformation of agriculture into large-scale agribusiness has resulted in these very complex commodity chains. And so that's what farming is today. Right? The farmer in a commercial setting is not just on his own with his farmhouse, bringing his produce to the market. Right? It's a much bigger scale operation. And those farmers are really connected politically, right? They're going to support interest groups that lobby for them in Washington, right? They're going to be connected to banking, because in order to manage such a giant farm, you often need to get loans to buy new land, to buy these giant hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. So farming is no longer just this primary activity. Modern day farmers are much more complex than that. Okay, so take a look at the practice question. See if you can get it with your friends.
That's not true.
Usually it's like you extract all that stuff by yourself.
Wouldn't it be fake? Because like modern just farmers, wouldn't that be illegal? It's like
Ease, like more like instead of you just extracting it yourself, you should do it.
All right, what's the right answer? Ooh, we're not sure, huh? Isn't this a good picture? I think this is, yes, a laptop on the farm. Okay?
Where's the Wi-Fi?
I know. All right, the right answer is A.
I was right.
So it's not just the production, right? Like I just said, it's not just growing the food anymore. It's all of these other things that would be secondary and even tertiary things going on. B is not right because even though it is a small fraction of our labor force, that doesn't mean that it's no longer primary. I mean, they are still growing food. That's primary. It doesn't matter how small a percentage of the workforce it is. It's not C because agriculture has been totally affected by industrialization. D is tempting. Traditional patterns of farming are disappearing. Well, what does that mean though, right? It's too general. You could argue traditional farming is subsistence farming. So it doesn't give you enough information to pick it, even though when I read that I was like, yeah, it's no longer like farming like I think of farming. But it's not giving you enough information. And just because modern farmers use machinery doesn't mean that they're not engaging in primary activities anymore. They're using machinery, right, to grow their food and harvest their food. So you're left with A. Farming is all of those things, right? Agribusiness. Okay, so I'm going to do number 4 here, and then I'll give you a break before part C. So let's finish up with explaining the interdependence among regions of food production and consumption. So we know that in this era of globalization, every country is connected. Every country imports and exports something. Now, if we were ever left totally on our own, America would be better off than most places, right? Because we can grow enough food for ourselves. We could bring back more of our manufacturing, right? But that's unrealistic in today's world. So it's asking you to explain the interdependence. And so I have some things here. Agricultural products move mainly from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere. So the Americas make a lot of the world's food, right? You should know that. And we export a lot of that to other countries. The biggest exporting regions are the United States, where we export the most, but Latin America does as well. And they have a pretty low population, so their percentage of exports is great, right? Southeast Asia and the South Pacific also export. Southeast Asia exports a lot of rice, for instance. And our share of exports has declined from about 20% of the world total. That's a lot. In the 1970s, we exported 20% of all of the food for the world. Think about how reliant and how powerful that would make the United States. So many countries are depending on their food coming from us. But today, we only export 10% of the world's total, which is still the most. But other countries have gotten better at farming because of the third agricultural revolution and this biotech, this green revolution stuff going on. Okay? So we still export the most, but at a smaller percentage than we used to. Question?
Who's the second?
Netherlands. And actually, I can show you that. I have a chart I'll pull up for you in a second. You can see importers and exporters of food here. So again, look at the Americas. We're almost all red, which means net exporter. And then look at the Eastern Hemisphere, mostly purple. Importers. Wheat is the most important crop because it's made for bread, you know, and most consumed and cultivated crop. If it ever asks you which regions would import the most food, think about countries, especially in the Middle East and Northern Africa, who are mostly desert. And a lot of those countries have oil, right? So they have money to spend on importing food, but not all of them do. And that's why many of them are actually pretty hard up when it comes to getting enough food to feed their people. Okay, I want to show you that one picture, and then I'll give you a little break. Let's see. Here you go. So these are the countries that are the largest Exporters, US, Netherlands, which I'm going to talk more about. How can a country so small export so much food? It's really amazing. I'm kind of obsessed with it. But then, you see other countries here as well. Some European countries are mixed in. Canada's there. All right, so let's say come back at 1:10, hit the bathroom, take a little break.